Doucet are our speakers. This is their first time to the Electric Railroaders Association, but they've made many presentations. I found this presentation when they spoke before the Toronto Genealogical Society. This presentation is a sweeping and accessible, about 90, 100-minute journey through the history of Toronto transit from the 19th through the 21st century. I'm not going to go through everything that was on the website. I'll let them do that, but let me introduce both of them. It's a father and son team. Dr. Brian Doucet is a researcher, author, filmmaker, photographer, and award-winning teacher and associate professor in planning at University of Waterloo. He has spent time in the Netherlands. Let me just, okay. Make sure, Brian and Michael, you unmute yourself. Here we are. He's returned to Canada in, oh, wait, we have many more. Nope, I think we have everybody in. Okay. Brian has held a Canada Research Chair. He's been awarded 6 major research grants and was a 2025 winner of the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance Teaching Excellence Award. He's also a writer, host, and director of Thinking Beyond the Market, a film about genuinely affordable housing, a feature-length documentary film which explores solutions to the housing crisis. Dr. Michael Doucet, who's Brian's father, is Professor Emeritus in Geography at Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson, where he taught from 1977 to 2010. While at TMU, he developed and taught a very popular course known as Geography of Toronto. Does that sound familiar to you, Paul Gakowski, who I know is on? Paul Gakowski did a course on Geography of New York. Dr. Michael Doucet was born in Toronto. His interest in urban transit developed at a young age. His father took him on the first leg of the Toronto subway on opening day. Since 1970, he's been taking photographs to illustrate change in his home city, many of which depict the transit system. Both Doucets are the authors of the award-nominated book Streetcars and the Shifting Geographies of Toronto, a visual analysis of change, which uses historic images of city streetcars. It's a lot of here of then and now pictures and also sort of analytics on how this city has changed. And I'm sure at some point you should feel free to plug that and other relevant books. With that, I am turning it over to you, Brian. So please take it away.
All right. Thank you very much. Can everyone, first of all, see the slide of the PCCs in front of us? All right.
Yes.
Great. Well, Bob, thank you very much for that very kind and detailed introduction. Yes, we will absolutely 100% be plugging the book. And I will also be talking about another streetcar photography book that I am working on at the moment. But to kick us off, we will turn the floor over to Michael to sort of set the stage. And I hope you all enjoy this presentation of over 150 years of streetcar history in Toronto.
Well, thank you, Brian. I think it's worth exploring how interest in this field might have developed. And so here are some pictures to depict some of the firsts in relation to transit in my history. The picture on the left shows the original subway cars on the first leg of the subway that opened on March 30th of 1954. I'd recently turned 6 years of age when it opened, and my father took me on opening day to explore this new feature in Toronto. And so from that age, I developed quite an interest in transit and how it developed within our city. Picture on the upper right is of Peter Witt streetcar 2890 at the Halton County Radial Railway. And my first visit there was in May of 1971. By the way, that Peter Witt car is now at the Seashore Trolley Museum in Kennebunkport, Maine. And the lower right is just a picture from the first transit charter that I took, sponsored by the Upper Canada Railway Society. And that one, Peter Witt 2894, it was in September 1975. So since that time, I've tried to be there when something new opened in terms of electric transit in Toronto. And as you'll see later in the presentation, I've continued that with Brian and now with Brian's son. So if we have the next picture, as you do these things, you seem to collect some memorabilia. So I got a certificate in 1962 for riding the last Bay DuPont streetcar. I got a button when I rode the Spadina subway in 1978. And then in the lower right is a picture of the Scarborough Rapid Transit System, which opened in 1985. And that was Brian's first day riding. And he was about 5 years old at the time. Okay, next. We'll both comment on this, but like any good father, I would read stories to Brian at bedtime. And as he got a little bit older, his favorite book became 50 Years of Progressive Transit. And he referred to this as the Yellow Book. So he'd say, Dad, can we have a story out of the Yellow Book tonight? Okay, Brian?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's as you can imagine, these kind of traditions would become quite common and normal for me. The house where I grew up in, where my parents still live in Toronto, near Yonge and Eglinton, 4 houses down from that house is the view you see in the middle of the photo, a pedestrian bridge over the subway tracks at Yonge and Eglinton. So I could see these trains literally from my bedroom window. And that little guy on a Peter Witt charter with the railroad hat in the middle there, that is me, probably about 4 or 5 years old, as the two of us there as well, in the upper right with Peter Witt 2300, which in the early 1980s was based on the house at the Toronto waterfront. And then the photo at the bottom right is the last day of CLRV operation in Toronto back in 2019. So we're interested in this obviously as rail fans, as people who are interested in streetcars as a hobby, but we're both or have both worked as professors in geography and planning, teaching about cities and researching about cities. And we decided to combine these two interests, our academic interests and our own hobby, to put together the book that Bob talked about at the outset, Streetcars and the Shifting Geographies of Toronto, where we took historic photos of the streetcars taken by a lot of enthusiasts, and we rephotographed them. And we used these before and after, or these now and then sets, as a starting point, not necessarily just to talk about the transit, but to talk about the changing nature of Toronto and try and add something of, well, what can the photos taken through this hobby, what can they tell us? What can they render visible about the ways in which Toronto has changed? And that book came out in 2022 and was nominated in 2023 for the Heritage Toronto Book Award.
Well, as Brian was growing up, he really couldn't escape streetcars because we have a number of pieces of artwork scattered throughout the house. And this slide shows some of the ones that you can find in our house to this day. By the way, if you Google Toronto streetcar art, I think you'll be amazed at how much artistic work focusing on streetcars has emerged over the years. Well, I'd like to make the point that streetcars really are an icon of Toronto. And to provide some evidence, in my wanderings around the city, I've come across a couple of dozen or more murals painted on the sides of buildings that depict streetcars and are part of the life of the city. So we really find quite a few of these in mostly in parts where streetcars ran, but not always. And some of them are really reminiscent of the lines that run along these streets. This particular mural is on St. Clair Avenue West, which is home to the 512 St. Clair route. And this one depicts one of the newest streetcars that we have here. We have a couple of programs, quite interesting, in Toronto that allow people to paint utility boxes. And I found a couple of these. They're shown on the left-hand side of the slide that contain streetcars. The one in the lower left is, I think, a real Toronto example of this form of art. So it has a streetcar and a blue jay. In the lower right, there's a very nice two-dimensional rendition of a PCC streetcar. And I've even found some garage doors in my wanderings that have been painted with streetcars. The one on the left is very clear, destination, home base. The one on the right is a little harder to see. And I'm sure many in the ERA are interested in scale models of streetcars. There are quite a few now that depict Toronto streetcars. One on the left is a Bachmann Peter Witt, which unfortunately is more like a Baltimore a Peter Witt than a Toronto one in terms of the treatment of the front. We have a variety of PCCs that are available. The one on the left is a model of a Kansas City, ex-Kansas City car. The one on the right, a model of the original Toronto PCC number 4000. And Brian and I have pre-ordered a CLRV model from Rapido Trains, and we're anxiously awaiting its arrival.
And just this week, Rapido sent us messages separately that their Gloucester subway car models are now ready for shipping out. So much anticipated adding to the layouts in both our basements.
Yes, I'll be picking mine up tomorrow. In terms of streetcars as icon, there's clothing that we can purchase. Here I am in a PCC sweatshirt with a PCC hat. You can drink beverages. I'm the glass on the right I have in my hand at the moment, filled with water. But there's a PCC glass, a CLRV glass, and we forgot to include pictures. But you can even buy cans of beer that have streetcars, Toronto streetcars, on them.
So as Michael illustrated, I mean, these are more than just ways to get around. The streetcars are very much an icon of the city. And I think there's a couple of images and a couple of things as we start out our talk that are maybe just good examples of how the streetcars fit in with the city. The image on the left is an ad for micro weddings, which also tells you probably something about the cost of living in Toronto. Invest in your marriage, not your wedding. It is a very expensive city. And so something like this, you could imagine a business would be quite successful. But in the background, again, this is a Toronto micro wedding. That's the company. In the background, there is a picture of a streetcar, which really hits home to people that it's Toronto, right? The last time the Toronto Raptors were in the NBA final in 2019, there was images in the opening montage of getting everyone ready for the game. There were images of CLRV streetcars because, of course, everyone across Canada associates that with Toronto. So yes, they are iconic. but they are also a means of transportation. About 250,000 people ride streetcars every day. But they're not exactly fast, and I will talk about that a little later on in the presentation. And so I think the last word on streetcars in Toronto has to go to my son when he was 4 years old. So going back a few years now, and we were traveling across the city on the 505 Dundas car. And he is used to, we live in Kitchener-Waterloo, about 60, 70 miles west. We have a light rail transit system with full signal priority. It's very fast. If we go into Toronto by train, we take GO Transit trains, which again are fast. So he's not used to riding slow streetcars stuck in traffic. The average speed of Toronto streetcars is about 6 or 7 miles an hour. So we're riding and he's looking out, observing. He's very observant. And at one point in the ride, after basically we missed our connection with our GO train, because we're taking so long to go across Dundas, he turns to me with total sincerity and says, "What happens if you take the streetcar and you want to get somewhere quickly?" And I did not have an answer to that. But I think that really sums up some of the challenges with this system today that has so much potential, but really doesn't live up to its potential. So a little bit of an overview before we dive into the history. The streetcar network in Toronto dates back to 1861, first using horse cars. It was electrified in the early 1890s. An interesting aspect of the Toronto streetcar network, or what we'd call the legacy streetcars, not the new light rail lines, but the original streetcar network, has a track gauge of 4 feet 10 and 7/8 inches, or 1,495 millimeters, slightly different from the standard gauge. It was under private ownership from 1861 until 1921, with municipal takeover in September of that year. So one of the first major cities in North America to have a municipalized transit system. Very similar time frame to Detroit, about 4 hours down the road. The current system has 11 lines, 685 stops, and 83 kilometers of track. In 2025, the streetcar system carried almost 80 million riders, or about 223,000 each day. Since 2017, the overhead has been converted to pantograph operation. It was one of the last major systems in the world to use a trolley pole. Another interesting aspect of the system is that there are 3 grand unions: King and Spadina, Queen and Spadina, and King and Bathurst, where streetcars can turn in every single direction.
Yeah, here's a picture of the Queen and Spadina Grand Union with PCC car 4549 proceeding eastbound through the intersection. As Brian will mention later on, this is one of the areas where the streetcar system is perhaps at its slowest, given all the switches in these Grand Unions, 16 in all.
So a little note on the photography. As you've seen already, and you will see, this is mostly a presentation of photos, not a whole lot of text. And even when we teach or taught our university students, that tended to be the style of our lectures. But it is worth mentioning just a little bit about where some of the images have come from. So a lot of the photography in this presentation comes from the late John F. Bromley, pictured at the left there. Either from his own photos that he took starting in about 1961, 1962, or photos from his collection. John passed away in 2019, and I'm actually now working on a new streetcar photography book project with his widow, Margaret, working on taking about 300 of his best, most important images, not just from Toronto, but from Pittsburgh and from Europe and other places as well, and curating that into a book which will be published hopefully in a couple of years. My father has many images in this series as well. My own images started in the late 1990s with slides, and my own photography has shifted from trying to photograph just the vehicles, and I think this is the same with a lot of enthusiast photographers, really focusing on the vehicles, to trying to situate the streetcars within the urban environment in which they run. And so I'll show you some more of those images from the end of the CLRV days a little bit later on. But before we do that and talk about some of the present day challenges, we really have to dive into um, some of the history. Oh, and just a final note about the photographers. Wherever possible, we've tried to identify the photographers. Again, most of the historic images come from John Bromley's archive. Where we don't know or where it's unclear, we've just left it blank. And if anyone knows a photographer of an image that has no credit, we'd love to get that name as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of the history of public transit in Toronto, we go back all the way to 1849 when the Williams Omnibus line was established. It ran from St. Lawrence Market at King and Jarvis up to Yorkville, roughly at Bloor and Yonge. In 1861, City of Toronto granted a 30-year franchise or charter to the Toronto Street Railway Company to build and operate horse car lines. So Canada's first street railway line opened in September of 1861. And from the start, they used what we call TTC gauge, 4 feet 10 and 7/8 inches. And the wisdom about this is that it was done so that the railway companies wouldn't run their freight cars along the horse car tracks at night. Well, during the Toronto Street Railway era, the system expanded as the city grew. The franchise expired on the 16th of March, 1891. The city took over operations briefly, and they issued a new charter to the Toronto Railway Company. These are just some shots in the horse car era, various parts of the downtown area. 1891, as I mentioned, the Toronto Railway Company was granted a 30-year franchise. The key requirement on the part of the city was that the Toronto Railway Company was to electrify the system within 3 years, and it managed to accomplish that. The conversion to electricity started in 1892, and the last horse cars ran in 1894. The city, during this period, grew through annexations of surrounding areas, and there were different interpretations of the agreement between the city and the Toronto Railway Company. Toronto Railway Company insisted that it only had to service the parts of the city that existed in 1891. And that meant that large parts of the newly acquired territory was not served by the street railway lines. So the city, in fact, in the mid-teens, established the Toronto Civic Railway to provide some service within these particular areas. For the, Brian, if we could go back to the previous slide, the pink areas on this map are those that were annexed to the City of Toronto after 1891. You see the red lines on the map are Toronto Railway Company lines by 1920, and then you can see other colors going through the pink areas, green, for example, for the Toronto Civic Railway. The Toronto Railway Company seemed to lose interest in providing service. The track and the rolling stock deteriorated during the last years of the franchise, and the writing seemed to be on the wall that they would not be granted additional rights to operate streetcars in the city. A plebiscite was held in 1920, and the residents of the city voted by a ratio of 11-1 to have municipal takeover. And so the Toronto, then called Toronto Transportation Commission, was established on September 1st of 1921. And Brian's been showing just some pictures during this particular era. In 1921, the TTC took over 142 miles of track from the Toronto Railway Company, 22 from the Civic, and a few others from some of the radial lines that operated within the city of Toronto. By the end of 1922, the TTC added 57 additional miles of track, and 1928 was actually the year in which street railway trackage peaked in the city of Toronto. It's declined since then, but there's still quite a bit left. His tenure, they looked for new streetcars. Many of the Toronto Railway Company cars were wooden, and TTC was interested in something that was a bit more durable. So they opted for the Peter Witt design. Peter Witt, of course, was involved in transit in Cleveland and was responsible for the design of this particular type of streetcar where you entered from the front and exited from the rear doors. The TTC acquired 5 trailers. You can see a picture of a trailer train in this particular slide. There were large and small units of the Witt cars. The TTC found that it had to rebuild all of the track that it inherited from the Toronto Railway Company. It kept the 4-foot 7/8-inch gauge trackage, but it widened the devil strip, the space between the opposite direction tracks. 31, the TTC spent 30 during the Peter Witts redoing the trackage dollars in the mid-1920s. With inflation, is equivalent to about $548 million in 2025 currency. So this was quite an investment, and we would argue that because of the nature of that investment and the sizable sums involved, it made it much more difficult for Toronto to abandon streetcars because they were a modern system really had been established. Here's a great picture of the track work. This is one of the most complicated intersections in the entire system. This is where King and Queen meet Ronsonsvales and the Queensway. And you can see the amount of special work trackage that is involved in this particular intersection. Yeah, this is a view on Yonge Street. Peter Witt trains in operation. Down by the lakeshore, you can see some of the ferries, and in the distance, Toronto Island. So the streetcars were very popular means to get to the ferries, especially in the good weather in the summertime, for people to get over to the Toronto Islands. This is looking east on Front Street. The buildings on either side, the one to the right is Union Station, the one to the left is the Royal York Hotel. Both still stand and both date from the late 1920s. Again, very popular means of getting to this part of Toronto using the Peter Witt cars.
So the Peter Witts were the original Red Rockets in the 1920s and into the 1930s. But as many people on this call would know, the 1930s and the Great Depression and competition from the automobile and private buses led to the creation of the Electric Railway President's Conference Committee, formed in 1931, and involving most of the largest street railway operations in North America, with the task of redesigning the streetcar to be more efficient, faster, and lure riders back from other forms of transit. Several years of development led to an entirely new streetcar, not just in the aesthetic design, but new motors, propulsion systems, and trucks led to a standard streetcar design. The first PCCs in regular service debuted in Brooklyn in 1938. In Toronto, there were two main body types, 1936 style design, like this one you see here, and a post-war design first introduced after 1945, as well as two main manufacturers, the St. Louis Car Company and Pullman Standard, although the new PCCs that the TTC bought were assembled. The parts were shipped up and they were assembled at Canadian Car and Foundry in Montreal. The TTC had a total of 744 PCCs. This was the largest PCC fleet in North America. It constituted 540 new PCCs, 290 of which were the pre-war air-electric design spread across 5 orders, and 250 post-war all-electric PCCs spread across 3 orders, as well as 205 second-hand cars for the largest fleet in North America. By contrast, Chicago had 683 and Pittsburgh had 666, both of which were all new. In 1938, the 140 streetcars that the TTC ordered for their first order ended up being the largest single order for the air-electric car in North America. So as I said, there were 5 orders of these air-electric cars with some minor detail deviation between them. If anyone is a basketball or hockey fan, the building in behind, which was a postal sorting station when this photo was taken, the facade is still there, and that is now the Scotiabank Arena, where the Leafs and Raptors play. The post-war design, as I said, there were 250 units spread across 3 orders. The first 2 were for 100 cars each, the 4300 series on the left, the 4400 series on the right, which had multiple unit couplers and wiring for use on busy routes, starting with the Bloor Danforth crosstown line. And we can see them in operation here. The final order of new streetcars placed in 1951 was for 50 streetcars from St. Louis Car Company, again, assembled by Canadian Car and Foundry in Montreal. Combination of the arrival of new PCCs, the introduction of electric trolley buses, and a surplus of some streetcars led to the end of the old double-ended ex-Toronto Railway Company cars, which debuted in the 19-teens in 1948, as well as the abandonment of the Spadina line, which was one of the few routes that did not have turning loops at either end, so required double-ended cars, which again were abandoned in 1948. And the last radial or interurban line, which ran north along Yonge Street from the end of the city streetcar line at the Glen Echo Loop at the city limits, that ran as far north as Richmond Hill. Prior to the Depression, it ran all the way up to Lake Simcoe briefly. But the last radial line to Richmond Hill was abandoned in 1948 as well. And in 1951, the last of the ex-Toronto Railway Company wooden cars were also retired from service. And that's not a double-ended streetcar with the pole above the Kingston Road sign. That's a car going in the opposite direction. The Toronto Railway Company cars were single-ended. But the TTC still had a large streetcar network, and even though subway construction had started for the Yonge Line in 1951, the city still required new streetcars. By the early 1950s, the cost of buying new PCCs was quite expensive, as very few systems were ordering new streetcars. But there was a growing used or second-hand market as cities were abandoning their streetcars in the early 1950s, and the TTC was very active in purchasing second-hand streetcars. In 1950, it purchased 52 streetcars from the Cincinnati Street Railway, 25 all electrics that were built in 1947, so only 3 years old, and 27 pre-war air electrics, including the one you see here. Now, many on this call probably know that Cincinnati had two overhead wires like a trolley bus, and so here's another photo of the all-electric post-war car. Again, only ran in the city for about 3 years before coming to Toronto. So the trolley shroud on top of the PCC here is actually a little bit wider to accommodate the double poles, and that was one of the slightly different features of this series of second-hand cars. And you can see that evident here in this photo too, running in Toronto. The air electric cars until the mid 1960s predominantly ran along Queen Street. Here we see it at the western end of the Queen line at the Humber Loop. And here we see it further east on a Kingston Road car on Queen Street East. In 1952, the TTC purchased 75 PCCs from Cleveland Transit System, again, spread across 2 orders, which included the 50 Pullman Standard PCCs that Cleveland purchased new after World War II, and 25 PCCs that they purchased new or almost new from the Louisville Railway Company, who ordered PCCs after World War II for one line, decided they didn't want to do that anymore, and sold the streetcars for cash and buses to Cleveland. None of them ran in regular service in Louisville, but they did spend a few years running in Cleveland before the whole system, or the whole PCC fleet, was sold to Toronto. And here we can see the ex-Cleveland, ex-Louisville cars right after they've arrived into service. They have not yet had couplers. All the Cleveland cars eventually had multiple unit couplers installed. And even in the photo on the left, when they had the blinker doors that they came with new for Louisville, which the TTC promptly replaced with folding doors for any of the secondhand cars that came with them. The idea being they were better in the winter to have the folding doors rather than the blinker doors. Here's an early view of an ex-Cleveland Pullman car in Toronto. And here they are, 2 of the ex-Cleveland Pullmans running in a 2-car train on the Bloor-Danforth line, which by this point in the mid-1960s, when this photo was taken, was the busiest streetcar line in the city, with a service every 1 to 2 minutes in rush hour of these 2-car trains. TTC didn't stop there. In 1952, they purchased 48 Pullman standard cars from the Birmingham Electric Railway. Not only, like all the other, excuse me, all the other secondhand cars did they need to be repainted and regauged, the TTC also needed to get rid of the Jim Crow era segregation signs that were on these Birmingham streetcars when they ran in Alabama. They ran for a long time on Dundas and on Long Branch in Toronto. Up until the Bloor-Danforth subway opened in 1966, these different classes of streetcar ran pretty much on the same lines. After 1966, when the Bloor-Danforth line and a number of other lines were abandoned, the system would run, there'd be no set patterns. They'd run whatever was available on whatever line. The final secondhand order that the TTC purchased was in 1957 for 30 PCCs, all electric post-war PCCs from Kansas City. However, Kansas City was the only city in North America to order the post-war all-electric model without any of the little standy windows above or running along the side. So to some, they'd look a little bit more like a pre-war air car, but these were built after World War II with the um, all electric motors and features.
Now, just to add, Brian, I'm very fond of the ex-Kansas City cars. Those are the cars that I took every day when I was going to high school. They largely ran on St. Clair.
From here, right?
Yes.
And then out west on St. Clair.
Well, here's a nice picture of a WIT train. Another one on Yonge Street, nearing the final days of the operation of the Yonge line now. Now this is a WIT trailer train southbound at Yonge and Davisville, which is about 3 blocks from where Brian grew up and where I still live. And I think the next slide shows more or less the area today. Although, Brian, I would add, the gray building that you see on the far right is still there. It's designated as of historical significance. It was the Davisville Post Office, and I think dates from the 1890s. But the buildings to the left of that have, within the last couple of weeks, all been torn down for redevelopment. Well, this is the beginning of construction of the Yonge Street subway that began in the late 1940s and was finished by March of 1954. Yeah, something's come up on the screen and I can't see the rest of the map. Oh, there we go. So that's the streetcar system as it existed on the dawn of the subway era here in Toronto. And here we have some pictures of the imported from Great Britain Gloucester Railway and Carriage Company cars. They ran in 8-car trains during much of the day, but they would reduce that to 6-car trains in the evenings and on weekends. So with the arrival of the subway, we get the end of the Yonge streetcar line, ran from Union Station, the south end of the city at Glen Echo Loop. Here are some of the Peter Witts awaiting scrapping. A few went to museums, but nowhere near the total that we had in the city. You can see windows removed from some of the cars. The cars that remained from the Peter Witt fleet were relegated once the subway opened to rush hour and emergency services. Here are 3 of them at Long Branch Loop in the west end of the city. This was a fan excursion to mark the end of an era. And again, the final days of the Peter Witt streetcars. There's a picture of the last, on the right, the last Bay DuPont car. And as I mentioned earlier, I was a rider on that car. One of the local radio stations held a contest, and I managed to win a place on that streetcar.
So 1963 marked the end of the Peter Whitson regular service, and it also marked the opening of the first subway expansion, which basically turned the line from a straight up and down on Yonge Street to form a J hooking back north along University Avenue back up to Bloor Street. This was the first phase of a larger expansion that would come 3 years later, but it did result in several smaller streetcar abandonments, which led to the end of the Peter Witz. But in many ways, before we get into the streetcar story, there were a very small fleet of new subway cars built by the Montreal Locomotive Works, the first subway cars built in Canada, and the longest subway cars when they were built in 1963. So these used 6-car trains as opposed to the Gloucester cars using 8-car trains for a full platform, a standard the TTC has kept to this day. In many ways, the period between the early 1960s and the opening of the Bloor Danforth subway marked what we would argue is sort of the high point of the streetcar photography in Toronto. And there were a few factors. First of all, film and cameras were cheaper to buy, and film was cheaper to acquire. The quality of film was getting better. Kodachrome 64 was becoming the dominant color photography or color slide film. You also had very few other remaining streetcar cities in North America. Obviously, Pittsburgh being the big one that drew people from all across North America. But most other big cities had got rid of their streetcars, and Toronto still had a major fleet. It ran regular service. It was a very busy network, a very frequent network. The TTC had a saying, always a car in sight. And that basically meant if you missed a streetcar, well, you could see the next one coming behind it. And at that time, that was pretty much the standard on most of the lines that ran, especially in the downtown core. The busiest line was Bloor Danforth, the east-west crosstown line. That was being replaced by the Bloor Danforth subway. And this was the temporary interchange that was built to provide a connection point to the north and southbound Yonge subway lines at Bloor and Yonge. And as I said, there were set classes of PCCs that ran predominantly on the same routes throughout this period. So you had still a large number of air cars. The vast majority, almost all of them, were still in service, including the ones dating back to 1938. So you had a huge variation of PCCs, a dense network. You had interesting neighborhoods, and you had a lot of people, local and from further afield, probably some people on this call, who came up to Toronto to see what was still a very busy, dense network of streetcars. Had some work equipment as well, these snow sweepers. The sister of this one, S37, is at the Halton County Radial Railway. These were originally bought from an American company to come up to Toronto. Several car houses that provided good photo opportunities as well, again, for the different classes of PCCs that were in operation. And a very different city from today, a much more industrial city. This is only about a mile from the heart of downtown Toronto, and it was filled with warehouses, breweries, not the way it is today, with offices and condo towers and dense, vibrant city neighborhoods. So a few images to give you a flavor of this streetcar network at this point. Now, I mentioned John Bromley took a lot of these photos. The streetcar on the left is a 1947 PCC. The car on the right is a 1965 Barracuda, which was his first car. And there are several photos in his collection where he has his own car positioned beside or near the streetcar. So I thought I would throw that one in as well. The city is also on the cusp of a lot of change. It is starting to emerge as the most important city in Canada. In the 1960s, that was still firmly Montreal. It was the largest city, it was the financial headquarters, it was the main global city. But we are starting to see in this period some shifting of the approach of Toronto as it's becoming on that path to becoming Canada's major city, its largest city, and its most globalized global city. The building in the background there that you can see under construction, that is New City Hall, which was the product of an international design competition and actually won by a Finnish architect. And it was the first real building of any significance in Toronto that was designed in that way, and it was a major turning point in the city. And so, John has photographed this original Air Electric PCC from 1938 running past this site of the new City Hall. A few changes to the network in this time. Out in the West End, the Queensway was built as a fast road to the west with a private right-of-way for the streetcars in the middle, the only real section of private right-of-way in the city at this time.
Well, here's a shot showing the delivery of a new subway car. This will be for the Bloor-Danforth line. And there would be some big changes in terms of how people were getting around in Toronto and also in terms of the structure of the street railway network. Here's construction of that east-west subway line near Broadview and the Danforth. Very nice night photograph from Bromley showing a variety of PCC classes. So the Bloor-Danforth line initially opens in 1966 between Keele and Woodbine. And we then see some restructuring of the streetcar system. Most of the Bloor-Danforth line is underground, but there are a couple of exposed sections. Here's a picture of people gathered for the last running of the Harvard streetcar. It was a wonderfully serpentine route going east-west from across the city of Toronto. Along with Harvard, Bloor, Parliament, Coxwell, and Fort lines were all discontinued. And they were discontinued because a higher order of rapid transit had been introduced. So it wasn't getting rid of the lines for the sake of getting rid of them. They were being replaced by a higher capacity and faster mode of transit. Queen became the busiest line with the opening of the Bloor-Danforth unit trains on the Queen line. Winters ever present in late and early months of each year and car system.
So by 1966, when the Bloor-Danforth subway opened, in 1968, when the extensions of the Bloor-Danforth subway opened, the TTC, for the first time in its history, had a surplus of PCC streetcars. So a decade and a half before, it was buying streetcars from American cities that were abandoning their trolley networks. And by the late 1960s, the TTC was selling streetcars that it no longer needed as the network was getting smaller. 150 of the Air Electric PCCs were sold to Alexandria, Egypt in 1968. 10 were sold to Tampico, Mexico in the early 1970s. And there was a plan in the early 1970s that by 1980, there would be no streetcars left in Toronto. And I take this a bit to heart because I was born in 1980 and I have lived in the city for much of my life, a city that is, as we talk about, defined by its streetcars. And so 1980 would have been the day or the year when the TTC would have abandoned its last streetcar lines had things gone according to the TTC's plan. Now, by the mid 1960s, even though the network had contracted, it still had the largest fleet of streetcars in North America. But TTC planners and management were focused on abandoning the remainder of the network, as was happening in other big cities and had happened by that time in most big cities across North America and every city in Canada. There were proposals for a subway under Queen Street to replace what had then become the busiest line. We saw the photo of the multiple unit PCCs on Queen. And in 1969, the TTC released a plan to convert the rest of the network to buses and trolley buses by 1980. And St. Clair was the first route to be abandoned. However, in the early 1970s, a community group of activists formed an association called Streetcars for Toronto in order to lobby both the TTC and City Council to both retain and modernize the streetcars. There were a number of people in this group, including John Bromley, who used some of his European knowledge of visiting many places in Europe to look at some of the best practices and best examples from around the world at that time. And rather than protesting, they focused their efforts on producing a research report highlighting the economic, social, engineering, and planning benefits of the streetcars, particularly on busy lines. Their report argued that because of high ridership on most lines and the relatively low capacity of buses compared to streetcars, it would be far costlier to operate buses in the long run, as more buses and therefore more drivers would be required. Streetcars for Toronto released its report called A Brief for the Retention of Streetcar Service in Toronto, 3 weeks prior to the TTC's meeting on the 7th of November 1972. This gave plenty of time for the media to cover the report in great detail. The 18-page report also included a short overview of facts for media engagement. And basically, in that intervening 3 weeks, everyone in the city was talking about streetcars. On that 7th of November session, the board voted unanimously to retain streetcars. And it's important to stress, especially in today's political climate, that the impetus to retain and modernize the system didn't come from the TTC or City Council itself, but from a dedicated group of citizens who were engaged, who conducted their own research and wrote their own report. This was part of a wider citizen-led movement in the city at the time that included stopping an expressway, the Spadina Expressway, that would have run right through the heart of many neighborhoods, citywide networks of resident associations opposed to the demolition of their neighborhoods, and groups who successfully fought against the demolition of old City Hall. We showed you a photo of new City Hall under construction, and Union Station. There were a few small abandonments. The Rogers Road line was abandoned in 1974. And, this was a line that actually does not have a whole lot of photos taken by enthusiasts until the very end of operation. It was quite peripheral and it had fairly poor service. And we're talking about every 10 minutes or so, which compared to the downtown parts of the network was not very good. The TTC also underwent a major rebuilding program for 174 PCC cars that it purchased new in those 3 post-war models after World War II. They rebuilt large parts of the cars. They put these water bumpers, which were quite a unique feature at the time. They didn't last so long. New paint, new interiors, refurbished bodies to give them a longer lifespan. The last streetcar abandonment that took place was the Mount Pleasant line in 1976. It was replaced by a trolley bus. Now, Michael mentioned he's going to George's Trains to pick up his new subway car model from Rapido. Not this location. They've moved to a big spot out in the suburbs, but this is a great shot of the main model train store in Toronto, still in existence at a different location, and the Mount Pleasant streetcar. And of course, because it's the 70s, we've got a cigarette commercial, cigarette ad up above. Now, the TTC sold some of its secondhand PCCs to US cities in the mid to late 1970s to have a third life back in the United States. 29 cars went to Philadelphia to help replace vehicles that were lost in their car barn fire. 11 went to San Francisco in 1976, or sorry, in 1973, and 9 cars went to Shaker Heights in 1978, including some that were originally ex-Cleveland transit cars that the TTC bought from Cleveland in the early 1950s.
Well, the PCCs were getting a little old, and so the TTC decided that they needed to look for a newer version of the streetcar, and this is the prototype of what came to be known as the CLRV, or Canadian Light Rail Vehicle. This arrived late in 1977, so almost 40 years after the PCCs had arrived. Brian mentioned Old City Hall being threatened, and that is it, the large red stone building in the background. This CLRV, this is a picture from 1984, and this one has been painted up to commemorate the sesquicentennial of the city of Toronto. So the period 1934 to 1984, 150 years. This is the prototype of the articulated light rail vehicles, or ALRVs, and this one arrived in Toronto for testing in 1982. Toronto ended up ordering 52 of the ALRVs, and they were built between 1988 and 1987, 1989. This is a picture of the Witchwood car house, or some of the storage tracks there near St. Clair and Vaughan Road. And the PCCs often went there to await their final disposal. And Brian used to like me to drive by Witchwood if we were ever out in the West End, so he could see which PCCs were sitting there.
It is one of my earliest memories of driving out. My grandmother lived not entirely on the most direct route from, not the most direct route would go from our house to my grandmother's house via Witchwood and St. Clair, but we often could convince the driver to go that way to go see the PCCs. And I remember dozens and dozens of them at the time in the 80s waiting for staff.
TTC decided to rebuild 19 of the remaining PCCs and did that between 1986 and 1991. Some even were painted in the CLRV livery. We do get some new streetcar growth in the 1990s with the Harbourfront and Spadina lines going in. Here's a PCC running on the Harbourfront line. This is one of the rebuilt ones. And it was the intention to service Harbourfront with the PCCs, but unfortunately, there's a very steep curve coming south from Union Station and up onto Queens Quay. And the noise created by the PCCs in making that curve was driving some of the residents in the condominiums close by crazy. So the plan to run the PCCs on Harbourfront sadly had to be abandoned. What you see here, this is the streetcar running north on Spadina Avenue. What you see in the background is a building that originally was play and have played since 1989. So here we have the old meeting the new in 1985 picture. This is at the Humber Loop. The rebuilt streetcars, many of them found homes in museums. 6 of them went to, or kind of historic streetcar operations. 6 of them went to Kenosha, Wisconsin. This is a picture of one of those cars. This is the opening of the Spadina line in 1997. In July of 1997, and the opening of the Harbourfront extension, which allowed cars to go from Union Station to the exhibition grounds. This is happened in the year 2000.
So we're going to skip a little bit ahead to talk about the newest streetcars in Toronto, the Bombardier Flexity Outlook cars, which are now the only streetcars running on the original network. They're single-ended, 91 feet long, 5 sections, have 70 seats with a capacity of about 250 if you include standees. When they arrived in Toronto, when they arrived in Toronto, they arrived with both pantograph and trolley pole operation, and for the first several years were exclusively running under trolley pole. There is a retractable wheelchair ramp by the second set of doors there in the second section. And the original order was placed all the way back in 2009, which is part of the reason why we're talking about this after the 2000 and 1990s openings, because this has been a very long process to get them all delivered. The original order was for 240 cars. So about 250 of the CLRVs and ALRVs were going to be replaced by fewer but longer light rail vehicles. And as we'll explain, there has been a subsequent order to bring the fleet up a bit. All but 8 were built in Thunder Bay, Ontario, which is quite a ways away from Toronto, and shipped by rail. The other 8 were built in Kingston, Ontario. Kingston's about 2 hours away. Thunder Bay is about 850 miles northwest of Toronto on the opposite side of Lake Superior. The first vehicle arrived in Toronto on the 25th of September 2012 and went into service on the 510 Spadina line in August of 2014. Due to production problems, the last car in the original order didn't arrive until January of 2020, about a month after the last CLRVs were retired from service. And in May 2021, an additional order was placed for 60 cars from Bombardier, although they were built in Thunder Bay by Alstom, who acquired Bombardier in the intervening time. The first of those entered service in late 2023, and the last came in 2025. So the TTC streetcar fleet now numbers 264, which is more than the CLRVs and ALRVs combined. Here's 4400 in service on 31st of August 2014. And again, you can see the trolley pole. And the last one to enter service here, 4663. Now, Michael will talk about the new barns here that are the main storage facility for these cars.
Yeah, these are the Leslie barns that opened in late in 2015. And we have a program in late May every year called Doors Open Toronto. And there's often some element related to the TTC that's included in the Doors Open program. And in 2016, the Leslie barns were included. So the photographs that you see in this slide were taken in late May of the newest of our car houses. It cost something on the order of $500 million. And I think they have outside storage for about 120 to 130 of the Bombardier Flexity Outlook LRV. It's a very modern facility. Cars can be stored to older facilities, the Russell Car House on Queen Street East and the Roncesvalles Car House out in the West End at King Queen Roncesvalles and the Queensway. And there's a major repair facility called Hillcrest on Bathurst Street that is being modified at the moment to accommodate the much longer. I think our next one is, oh, there we are, Cherry Street. Some new trackage. To allow streetcars to come down to a very popular area called the Distillery District.
So I want to talk briefly about Toronto streetcar network since 2016. And I don't necessarily want to say something about every photo, but I want to show you a bit of what that network has looked like. These were all pictures that I took first when I was living abroad, returning to Canada, returning to Toronto, and since 2017, since I've moved back, and spent quite a lot of time towards the very end of the days of the CLRVs, taking photos of them in the city. This is taken from the top of the CN Tower. This is one of the Grand Unions at King and Spadina, and you can see 4 CLRVs and a Bombardier on the far right. Or sorry, you can see 5 CLRVs. Very busy service still on King. And then if you look up to see the CN Tower, you can see where I took that previous picture from.
Brian, there was a question on the chat. Are you aware if the CLRVs, was there a second-hand market for those cars, or are they just scrapped?
They were all scrapped. Some went to museums. There are some at the Halton County Radial Railway. The TTC has had a few in a historic collection, but all their historic collection is now at Halton while Hillcrest is being renovated. I'm not sure when or if the historic fleet will return back to Toronto. Most were scrapped. They were scrapped in a scrapyard down in Hamilton, about an hour away. Unfortunately, most were also scrapped with things like their roll signs and their number boxes and their short turn signs in place. So there was no interest on the secondhand market from anywhere. They're not wheelchair accessible. They were rusting quite badly towards the end, many of them. So they were scrapped.
Were there, Peter, the other question that came up, I know there are Peter Witt cars or car saved. Were there any Peter Witt trailers saved? That was another question.
There is one body, like shell of a Peter Witt trailer at Halton, um, but it's not in any kind of shape that makes it resemble a streetcar. So no,
Okay.
they were predominantly.
And the other question that came up, the ex-Birmingham PCCs, were any of those saved or were they sold or scrapped?
They were all scrapped.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
they
you.
were all scrapped. Um, yeah, it wouldn't be a Toronto presentation without winter. This was 2004, I think. A bit of an ice storm that caused ice on the overhead and a delay. But you can see again what I talked about. Toronto in the 60s was sort of on the cusp of becoming this major international city. And by the time we revisit this photo series, we can see that the city really is. This is King and Bay. This is Canada's Wall Street. All the major banks in Canada are located within a few hundred yards of here. The tallest office towers are all here, and the busiest streetcar lines are here, as are the busiest subway line and the GO train. But we're talking streetcars here. A lot of big redevelopment projects, right, that changed the landscape of the city. There was a well-known pub on this corner for a long time, and now we have this big entertainment and shopping complex. Part of which the movie theater there, the Cineplex, is actually used as lecture theaters by Toronto Metropolitan University, and Michael did teach some classes in there over the years. Again, right in the heart of downtown. So one
Yeah,
of the things.
I taught geography of Toronto in there, and there were fairly big theaters with wonderful large screens. It was great for showing pictures.
Yeah, I threw this photo in not because I'm a fan of the GMC truck, but because it illustrates a problem that really plagues the network is that they run on dense, busy streets. There's a lot of left turns that are permitted, and you can see that there could be a couple hundred people on that CLRV that are waiting for that car to turn left. And that is one of the reasons why the network was slow back then and still is slow today. There are many, many connections with the subway. The ones downtown, there's no fare paid area, so you need a transfer or you tap your card again and get your free transfer between vehicles. When you get further out, the transfer areas are within the fare paid zone. But here you can see an example of subway below and streetcar on the surface. An old warehouse. I think we revisit this later on. This was an old food terminal warehouse, food storage warehouse that has been completely rebuilt since this photo was taken, which was not that long ago, less than 15 years ago. Lots of new construction. The city of Toronto has actually had policies and planning in place to try and get more density along major avenues. And in the downtown core, a lot of them have streetcars running on them. One of the interesting things about Toronto, and this is the same with many cities, but the downtown has a lot of development, lots of big towers, and along the subway lines and particular intersections. But much of the rest of the city actually looks very similar to when it was laid out when the streetcar lines were first built 100, 120, even 150 years ago. This example here of Gerrard Street in the east end of the city illustrates that. Canada's first public housing project, Regent Park, just east of the downtown core, was built just after World War II and is subsequently now being rebuilt piece by piece into a mixed income, much denser kind of development. We don't have a whole lot of this kind of sort of urban renewal in Toronto, but there are some examples, and a lot of the early stuff was on streetcar lines. So here you can see that neighborhood being rebuilt, the towers in the background, replaced what was similar housing to what you saw in the previous view and what you see on the left here. So again, a growing city, a lot more people coming to the downtown core, and a lot of the poverty that was downtown shifting further outside of where the streetcar lines run. So as I said, I was taking a lot of photos of the old CLRVs and their final, really in the 2019, especially in the fall. And by early November, the CLRVs were only to be found on two lines: the 506 Carlton line, which runs east-west, which is facing the where I'm taking the photo, and then the 511 Bathurst line north-south, which is where the streetcar crossing the street is operating on. So I spent a lot of time on these lines. Here I said we return back to that old industrial warehouse building, and you can see actually it's been completely rebuilt brick by brick with a whole new building added on top. So a very kind of powerful example of just some of the changes that Toronto has gone through over the last, well, really for many decades, but intensifying recently. Got to get the CN Tower interview. Bob, yes.
Yeah, it was a question. Who maintains the right-of-way surface between the rails? Is it TTC or the city?
In terms of
the maintenance, like if the pavement gets cracked or needs maintenance. It used to be street railway companies, and I'm sure things have evolved.
Well,
yeah, the TTC rebuilds the track, so I would say they're responsible.
Yeah.
Okay. The other observation that one of our participants who retired from San Francisco Muni, it seems though, I'd like you to comment on it. It seems like there's some transit priority into Toronto, but not within Toronto. But maybe you can address, there was one project on King Street. I think it's still active. Are you going to talk about
that's coming
that?
up. Don't worry.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, Brian will be talking about that shortly.
Very good. Okay.
I like this picture, a little bit of a different trolley photo, but really illustrates, goodbye Toronto. It was a great ride. The TTC did put some decals out on a few of the CLRVs in their final month. This was really going into November, December 2019. And so I spent quite a lot of time just walking up and down Bathurst, the last line to have CLRVs, taking some of these photos. And, the final day or two, there were a lot of enthusiasts out taking photos. This was the final day of regular service on Bathurst, 28th of December, 2019. So, of course, we met up and had a little ride on Bathurst and took some photos for one final regular service CLRV ride. A few night photos here along Fleet Street on the Bathurst line. Anyone that's been to Canada probably knows Tim Hortons. So, of course, I think I'm obliged under Canadian law to include a Tim Hortons photo in a presentation about Toronto streetcars. So you can judge for yourself whether that's one icon or two icons in that picture. But again, the last night of service. The next day, there was a bit of a farewell parade. And this was the first time that my son, who was not even 2 years old at the time, came out to one of these events. So while I'm taking these pictures here, I've got him. I'm holding him on my arm. One hand, got the picture, the camera going in the other. We walked around a little bit, went for a last ride. They had a sort of ceremonial last ride along Queen Street. And then this is the last photo of regular service, or last CLRV Toronto photo that I took, and you can see I'm not alone. There's folks there in front of the Starbucks taking pictures as well. So from the end of 2019, it's been an all low floor, all accessible system, which Michael will talk a little bit more about.
Well, the current system has 11 lines, 685 stops, and about 52 miles of trackage. In 2025, the streetcars, as I think Brian already mentioned, carried about 80 million people, about 224,000 a day, a weekday. Since 2017, the overhead has been converted for pantograph operation. That's been completed. If you look at the busiest surface routes in the Toronto transit system, 4 of the top 5 are streetcar lines: King, Queen, Carlton, and Spadina. Proof of payment and all-door operation was introduced on the system once the Flexities had arrived. 4 of the 11 routes operate 24 hours a day. Connections to 16 subway stations, 3 underground and 5 others within fare-paid areas. 3 routes operate on private right-of-ways. 2 are new and 1 has been rebuilt. The rebuilt one is St. Clair. The new ones are Spadina and Harbourfront. Many of you may not know that Toronto is the 3rd largest movie and television production center in North America, after New York and, of course, Los Angeles. And many of the films and TV shows that are filmed here, produced here, are done in such a way that Toronto is supposed to depict somewhere else. It's often New York City. I've seen it as Baltimore and so forth. But this particular shot is of Queen Street, and one of the new Bombardier Flexity streetcars is eastbound past something called Kim's Convenience. And Kim's Convenience, I think, was shown on some networks in the US, was a television program that was unabashedly set in Toronto. So it's one of the few instances where Toronto actually appeared as itself. And there have been a couple of other shows that I've enjoyed over the years. Interestingly, all 3 that I'll mention set on Queen Street, Street Legal and Private Eyes and Kim's Convenience. And in all 3 shows, the opening credits featured streetcars. So we celebrate the chance for Toronto to actually be itself.
Now, Bob, you had mentioned this King Street pilot, and so yes, I do want to talk about it because, well, I'll get to the main message first. It was quick, easy, cheap, and transformative. It's a unicorn project. It shouldn't exist, but it was fantastically successful. So before it was introduced in November of 2017, walking was often compared with streetcar speeds on King, and it was often faster to walk a couple miles than it was to take the streetcar. So the idea was to give streetcars priority to speed up the service on what was the busiest surface line in the city. It was a very, very basic concept. At most traffic lights in the downtown core, cars could not go straight through. They had to turn right at every intersection. So you went right away to changing King from a through street that was quite busy to a street that you'd only access in a car if you were needing to go somewhere along that street, and then you had to quickly turn right. So a very basic concept. There were also some place-making initiatives that were put in, and they had little bump outs for the streetcar stops. Ridership soared. Within the first year of this pilot project, it was first a pilot project before being made permanent, ridership went up from 65,000 a day to 84,000 a day on this one line. So this happened pre-pandemic, so I'm going to put this into some pre-pandemic context of ridership. That 84,000 a day carried on the King streetcar line in 2019 was more than any single GO Transit regional rail line in Toronto, in the Toronto region, entire LRT systems in Houston, Salt Lake City, all 6 trolley lines in Philadelphia, the Baltimore Metro, the Miami Metro, and the Chicago Green Line L. The King Street line carried more people than each of those lines or systems. There were also placemaking initiatives, and it turned into quite a nice environment, a fast environment. Cyclists would use it to get across the city because it was quieter and it was very fast. And the streetcars were far faster than walking, and in fact, the fastest way to get around. However, there was a lack of enforcement. The placemaking infrastructure started to deteriorate. There were additional road closures in the downtown core, and the whole thing kind of fell off the rails figuratively. And the low point was when a TTC streetcar driver was ticketed in late 2023 by a Toronto police officer for blocking an intersection because they couldn't get through. The Toronto Star did a race about less than 2 miles across downtown on King Street, and they had someone walk, bike, drive, and take the streetcar. The bike was the quickest, then walk. Driving was utter hell, but it was faster than the streetcar. And to go that, I'd say 2.5 kilometers, mile and a half, took 79 minutes on the King streetcar. So that was, in many ways, the low point. A few weeks later, I actually went to Toronto one day and I was going to live tweet. I was going to bring a really good book with me, sit on the streetcar, and live tweet how long, when Twitter was still a thing, how long it took. But literally the day that I arrived, the city had traffic enforcement officers directing traffic at some of the main intersections. So a week later, it took 11 minutes to go that 1 kilometer. Not amazing by any stretch of the imagination, not amazing, but still much better. But one of the issues, as I said at the outset, is that Toronto streetcars are very slow. Recent studies showed that they are about 10.7 kilometers an hour as an average speed. By comparison, a city like Munich is almost double that at just under 20 kilometers an hour. Why is this the case? Now, I said at the outset, we're not going to have a whole lot of text on these slides, and you've seen a lot of pictures, but I do think it is worth highlighting some of this in text form as well. Why are Toronto streetcars, by some measure, the slowest in the world? And I wouldn't compare these against, some of these little streetcars like in Detroit or some of these American downtown streetcars. They're very different. This is a much busier, bigger network. But why are they so slow? Well, there is a lack of good signal priority. As we'll talk about in a minute, this really got attention when Line 6 opened last year, but it plagues the older network as well. There is some signal assistance, but it's not very good. Long light cycles. So if you miss a light, you have a long wait for the next one to come. Now, the TTC also contributes to its own slowness by having a lot of slow zones where the streetcars have to go much slower because of the track or because of switches or so on. So they have situations going through intersections as well where they've self-imposed slow zones for various reasons, which contribute to the slow speed. There are a lot of emergency stops made by streetcars. If they go ever so slightly, like the tolerance is very low, ever so slightly above the permitted speed in that section, it throws the emergency brakes, which is not very comfortable for riders and also slows the system down. There are also, as I showed you that picture of the truck turning, far too many places where cars can turn left on the streetcar track, because again, this is an old network. And even where the right-of-ways have been built, as Michael said, on Spadina and St. Clair and Harbourfront, there are left turn lanes that get priority at the start of each light cycle, thereby slowing things down even further. Now, some of the infrastructure that TTC uses really dates from 19th century technology. Most new systems that are building trams and light rail put in double point switches. Toronto still uses single point switches, which require the vehicles to stop at each open switch. So again, you can imagine those Grand Unions that we talked about and those other intersections with lots of switches. That slows things down. There are also too many stops. What did we have with 680 something stops on a network that's not that big? Stop consolidation is really, really tough because no one wants to lose their stop, but the streetcars do stop every block or two, which can slow things down as well. And when there's a diversion, when there's a road that's closed or track that has to be repaired, rather than just having a crossover switch so that they can proceed on temporary track or a temporary crossover, there are long and lengthy diversions, which again, if you combine with the long light cycles, the slow zones, the lack of signal priority, makes for very long diversions.
Brian,
So
there was a question since we're talking about speed. There was proof of payment and all-door boarding. Did TTC or anyone do any studies to see if that improved things a little bit, or was it negligible?
that's a good question. I haven't seen any studies. I mean, the research and the evidence suggests that all door boarding is the fastest way to get people on and off busy routes. And in
Mhm.
fact, just the other day, a former student of ours, I saw him quoted on the CBC about London, Ontario's bus rapid transit,
Mhm.
which won't have the capability of having all door boarding. They don't have the fare technology or the enforcement staff. So even though you have this bus rapid transit, you're going to have everyone getting in the front door, which again is going to slow things down. I'm not sure if anything's been done on the impact of all door boarding on the TTC streetcars,
Okay.
but generally the evidence suggests that it makes it faster. And I would think that would be the case in Toronto. And it
Yeah,
is
that.
interesting that
Mhm.
all this attention of how slow things are has actually prompted some response. And it looks like the city of Toronto, now we have municipal elections this year, so we'll see what the city council priorities are come the fall. But we do seem to have from the mayor of Toronto and from city council and from staff a desire to speed up the streetcars. I think this has been a bit of a political embarrassment. Um, and I think that it's probably, I think things are going to be done. What kind of impact it will have remains to be seen because it's quite tough in this part of the city. But there is definitely a lot of public attention towards the slow speed of streetcars because that old adage from my son, what happens if you need to take the streetcar, you want to get somewhere quickly, that still rings true today.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
We mentioned the Halton County Radial Railway a few times, and it is, uh, I guess, the best of the streetcar museums in our country. The group that behind it formed in 1953, and they did that so they could save the car on the extreme left, 1326, and the green car towards the right, which is number 55. The TTC at the time in the 1950s had a small historical collection. They were going to get rid of them, and the people behind the HCRR decided to try and save them, and they did. And if you travel to the museum in the northern part of Milton, which is west of Toronto, you can see these cars, and you can't ride on those two anymore, I don't believe, but you can certainly ride on Peter Witt's and CLRVs and PCCs as well. So Brian and I are both members of the museum. It operates, uh, I guess, in some respects, year round. In different seasons, it's not open every day, so you should check their website. And it is dog friendly, so there we are with Brian's dog Feep.
So to round off, we want to talk about two exciting things that have happened in not only the last year since we did this previous talk with another group, but really just in the last few months. Two new subway lines, or sorry, two new light rail lines, Line 5 and Line 6, opened. And Line 6 opened before Line 5. We'll talk about why that is in a moment. Um, there are subway extensions for lines 1 and 2. There is a totally new rapid transit line an automated metro similar to the REM in Montreal that is under construction. And if you expand this reach beyond the city of Toronto, there are LRTs under construction or soon to be under construction in Hamilton, in Mississauga, and possibly extending Waterloo's light rail line down to Cambridge. So the first line to talk about is Finch West, which is in the very northwestern part of the city, a part of the city that developed well after the streetcar era, really in the post-war decades. And it runs west from the Finch West station on the western branch of Line 1, out towards the western end of the city at a branch of Humber College, or I believe now it's called Humber Polytechnic, but the stop is called Humber College. And it runs mostly along Finch Avenue, a wide sort of post-war thoroughfare with apartments, strip plazas, and all this kind of thing, what you'd expect in a neighborhood in a street built in the 50s and 60s. It is 10.3 kilometers long, or 6.4 miles, has 18 stations, and all but the two terminal stations are on the street in the middle of Finch Avenue. It cost $3.7 billion to build. The original estimate was $2.5 billion. Construction began in 2019, and the line opened on the 7th of December, 2025. The service is provided by 18 double-ended pantograph-equipped Alstom Citata sprint cars, which are 157 feet long, with a seating capacity of 120 and a maximum capacity of 292. The track is standard gauge. This is completely disjoined from the streetcar network, and it was built by Metrolinx, which is a provincial government agency that has no interest in building things to the TTC's gauge. It will build them at standard gauge. And interestingly, the platforms for each station are only long enough for one LRV. So there isn't really much possibility of going to two-car trains in the future. So some photos of construction and some testing photos here. And again, you can see the landscapes of this more suburban environment. The maintenance and storage facility is a fairly large, sprawling thing that's off to the north of Finch Avenue. And opening day. This was the first opening day of a new transit line in a long time, a totally new line in a very long time in Toronto, if you don't count extensions. And so lots of people came out to ride it. And of course, we came out to ride it. And, you know, my father mentioned he rode the opening line of the subway in 1954. I rode the opening line of the Scarborough, or the opening day of the Scarborough line in 1985. Michael's been at every opening day ride since 1954, and I've been at pretty much everything since 1985. So we thought this was something that would be fun to talk about. And so I contacted a few people in the media and said, hey, this is an interesting story. And we got on the CBC radio. We did an interview prior to the line opening. And then CBC, the website, did a nice little feature story about our family tradition. And of course, we took my son with us as well, who was enjoying his first opening day ride. And as Michael will tell you in a moment, his first of two opening day rides over the last 5 or 6 months. Some photos of the line in operation. And I flew back into Toronto last week, and I took that photo bottom right coming into Pearson Airport from the plane. The line is slow. Opening day. Opening days are always a bit of an issue, right? There's always some hiccups, always kinks to work out in the system. But opening day, I think for a lot of people, was a very, very big disappointment. And a lot of people vocalized that disappointment, that it was very slow. It did not have good signal priority. It had to go, the LRVs had to go very slow through intersections. Again, that's a TTC policy. And that it took about 50 odd minutes, I think, to go from end to end. Is that right? Or was that, it was, I don't remember the exact time, but it was slow. There
It
is
was
some.
close to an hour.
It was close to an hour, yeah, to go 10 kilometers. So very slow. There is someone in Toronto who's got some good media attention running racing streetcars. And he's done this on pretty much all the lines downtown. I think he's done Finch. Um, and let's put it this way, he wins almost all the time. And I think part of the frustration around Finch and how slow it was, because people were not expecting this. They were expecting a faster, dedicated right of way, signal priority, right? A fast LRT ride. The anger and frustration that people were vocalizing, I think, was part of the reason why transit priority and streetcar speed has climbed up the political agenda. So in a way, it was good that people were talking about this in an age of social media, and I think it has prompted at least more investigation and hopefully some meaningful response. And I think things are getting faster. Certainly on line 5, Michael will talk about it in a moment. They are getting faster than when they started. But sometimes that pressure and that highlighting how problematic things are, sometimes that can have an impact.
Brian, how does it compare the running time of the Finch West LRT compared with the bus that it replaced?
So the buses were generally faster, and there were some express buses. Yeah, it's an interesting one because obviously it's a more comfortable ride. It should be a more reliable ride when it works. It's a more reliable service. Station areas are nicer to wait and so on, but it is not at the moment. It is not faster than the bus it replaced.
But they're working, you said they're working on it, so it's not necessarily going to stay that way?
They're working on it, and
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
it will get better.
Okay.
They're installing traffic signal priority, and
Yeah.
it should get better. I don't want to get too political, but with both Finch and Eglinton, there are too many fingers in the pot. Brian mentioned that Metrolinx was the overseer of this project, was actually built by a consortium. It is operated by the TTC, but it's maintained by another consortium.
Mm.
So there, as I say, there are too many people or organizations involved in the construction, testing, and operation of these
Mhm.
new lines. They're trying to go the 3P route,
Mhm.
public-private partnership route, and it has not worked here. Both 6 and 5 were over time and well over budget.
Mm. Mhm. Okay, very interesting.
Okay, Brian wants me to talk a little bit about Crosstown, which is about 3 blocks north of where I'm sitting right now. This is 19 kilometers or 11.8 miles long, has 25 stations, only 10 of which are on the surface. The stations are long enough to handle 3-car trains. The line cost $12.82 billion. The original estimate was $9.1 billion. Eglinton Crosstown LRT is in fact the longest section of rapid transit we've ever opened in Toronto. There are longer lines, but they were built in stages. All of the underground stations are accessible. They have elevators and escalators. And I'll mention one point of pride. By sometime late next year, every subway station in the Toronto system, including the oldest stations, will have an elevator. And I don't think you would find very many systems around the world that could come close to that kind of accomplishment. Now, in terms of timing, construction on this line began in 2011, and it opened on my birthday, February 8th of 2026. Service is provided by 76 single-ended, pantograph-equipped Bombardier Flexity Freedom LRVs. They're currently running them as two-car trains, and they're coupled back to back because each one is single-ended. The line runs under and in the middle of Eglinton Avenue. In parts, it's a very wide thoroughfare like Finch, but in other parts, such as near where I live, it's quite narrow. The track, as with Finch, is standard gauge, and you might have noticed in terms of the livery on Finch, it's the same on Eglinton. It was selected by Metrolink, so it's unrelated to the TTC livery. Sort of gray, black, and white. Okay, construction phase. Parts of it are tunneled, so they had to lower tunneling machinery and do some massive excavation for some of the stations. The maintenance and storage facility, which is at the current west end of the line at Mount Dennis Station, had an open house in late May of 2019, again in conjunction with Doors Open. So the pictures that you see on this slide are from that visit. This is the testing phase, which went on for many, many months. We're starting to see some redevelopment along the line. Here's some houses boarded up and some notices of future development. And I suspect certainly in the eastern end of this line, we're going to see quite a bit of redevelopment. Here are some shots from opening day. And it was another opportunity for Brian's son to have a first day. You can see him in the lower left under the line 5 symbol. Again, a lot of people turned out, and there were really, I guess, 3 groups of people on these opening days. You get the transit enthusiasts in their multitudes. You get people who are just plain curious, and another group of people who are keen to use the line because it will become part of their daily existence. We have along line 5 a few examples of some public art that's been installed. Public art around the city fascinates me, so I try and capture it on film whenever I can. Here are 3 examples. The one on the left is called Light from Within. That's at Eglinton LRT station. The one in the middle is called Total Lunar Eclipse, and that's at the Don Valley station. And the one on the right is called Super Signals at Cedarvale station. The one in the middle is the most interesting one because that art was supposed to serve a purpose. Don Valley Station was originally known as Science Center Station. And in a controversial move, the provincial government closed the Ontario Science Center, so the station was quickly renamed Don Valley. Okay, what have we got next? More opening day, I think. Ah, yes, this is the move to have public art in the rapid transit stations really started in 1978 with the construction of the Spadina section of Line 1. And this is one of my favorite examples. This is in the Line 1 section of Cedarvale Station, and it's a work of art called Summertime Streetcars by Gerald Zeldin. And the one on the left, I think, reminds me of the Kansas City cars in terms of the paint scheme. Brian's son was keen on collecting souvenirs from opening day, so we, at each of the underground stations, they have transfer machines, so we managed to get a transfer for him from every one of the underground stations on the line. The stations at street level are similar in design. There's a lot of glass and a lot of natural light coming in. So most of them look like that. But there are a couple of interesting examples. Mount Pleasant Station, which is the one immediately east of where I would get on, is actually located in a former bank building that was put up in 1927. And the picture on the right is of Mount Dennis Station. Mount Dennis Station and the maintenance and storage facility are located on land that was formerly occupied by Kodak Canada Company Limited. And that building on the right is one of the original Kodak buildings from that day. Yeah, just Oakwood Station on the left. And each station has two entrances. One will have elevators and escalators, so easy access. But the other one, the secondary entrance, usually only has stairs. And some stations on this line are quite deep. So this is a warning at the secondary entrance to Avenue Station, informing people that if you don't like stairs, go to the other entrance, because there are more than 150 stairs down to platform level from this particular entrance, which is the equivalent to 8 stories below ground.
So a number of future projects will be opening in the coming years. The City of Toronto recently just approved, just within the last couple of weeks, a waterfront east LRT line that'll serve a whole new neighborhood that's being built in the former port areas. That's the dotted blue line that you see along the water east of downtown. There are extensions of Line 1 subway north of the city limits. There is an extension of Line 2 east towards a large shopping center where the former Scarborough RT ran, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Line 5 is being extended west, further along Eglinton Avenue West. And the biggest one is a whole new rapid transit system called the Ontario Line, which is the pink dashed line that you see kind of forming a sort of inverted L, which builds on decades worth of plans and proposals to build a relief line for the Yonge line, because Yonge gets very busy south of Bloor Street as people transfer from Line 2 to get downtown. So the Ontario line will help relieve overcrowding and connect with a lot of other parts of the city. There's construction is well underway. The line is going to be 15.6 kilometers with an estimated cost of about 17 to 19 billion. I think it will be more than that in the end, with estimated completion date somewhere in 2031. Again, I think it'll be a little bit later than that. It will feature automated trains, smaller than the current subway, use overhead wires, tunnels, and railway alignments, as well as viaducts. And for the purpose of our lecture, that's what's interesting is it will connect with the streetcar at 9 of its stations. We should give at least a brief shout out to Line 3, the Scarborough Rapid Transit line. If you've ever been to Detroit and rode the People Mover, or if you've been on Vancouver's SkyTrain and rode their original Mark I cars, it's the same technology that was developed in the early 1980s. Could speak much more about it, but we are running out of time. The line closed prematurely. It was slated for closure, but then there was a derailment and the line closed and never reopened after that. And now shuttle buses replace this line and carry people predominantly out to that Scarborough Town Center Mall, about 5 kilometers from the end of Line 2. We want to round off just with a few photos from our book. And as I said at the outset, the book looked at um, these historic images taken by streetcar enthusiasts. And I think, if you do this kind of photography, or if you've looked at these photos, if you followed along, yes, there's really interesting things about the vehicles. This is an ex-Birmingham streetcar, PCC there on the left. But there's so much richness and depth and curiosity in these images when they're taken showing the city in all its forms. And so we consider this to be a really rich source of information, of reflection, of analysis of how Toronto has changed and why. And so a few images here of, the downtown core, right? Toronto becoming, as I've said several times throughout this presentation, becoming Canada's major city, eclipsing Montreal, becoming the financial capital of the country. And you can see that in some of these photos here right downtown. These big redevelopments that I alluded to earlier, right? Demolishing a whole block of older buildings to put up, in the case of this photo here at Queen and York, the Sheraton Hotel and Conference Center, right? And lots of examples of that throughout the city. And so these photos, when paired with contemporary views and when put into more of an analysis and reflection, really offer a lot of insights into cities.
This is Yonge and Dundas, which is one of the major intersections. The major downtown mall is just behind us in these photographs. And I think these ones date, upper left is 1949 and lower left 1998. Upper right 2014 and lower right 2020. And you can see the change in the buildings and so forth. The lower right one is one that we were keen to include in the book because of the timing. You'll notice that in the other three photos, the intersection is very busy with pedestrians. But in the lower right one, there are very few pedestrians. And if we could window in and look at them individually, you'll find that most of them are wearing masks. So the lower right picture is a picture of one of the most important intersections in Toronto during the height of the COVID pandemic. Yeah, this is down near the waterfront. The prominent building that you see is the terminal warehouse, which was a cold storage facility that was built in 1927. You see a streetcar passing by there, the time, and then the picture on the right. So the one on the left is 1961. The one on the right is 2015. The terminal warehouse was renovated massively in 1983 and became not a warehouse, but a combination of retail. There was a theater in there, offices, and at the top you can see an addition of about 3 stories, and those were condominiums. Yeah, I'll just present one interesting statistic. This is an area near out to King Street West, and the building that you see in the left is part of the Massey Ferguson agricultural implements factory. And so Toronto was a manufacturing presence. And that particular picture dates from 1967. The one on the right is the same intersection in 2015. And what you see is a whole array of condominiums that have been put up in the intervening years. Consider this, in 1983, if you looked at the employment structure in Toronto, 21.9% of people worked in manufacturing. In 2019, only 8.7% were employed in manufacturing. So you can see in these pictures a drastic change in the economic structure of the city. As Brian has pointed out, There are far more people working in finance and real estate than in manufacturing today. The next one is Bathurst and Fleet, and again we've got Goodyear tire plant in the picture on the left, which is 1966, and on the right we have again industrial replaced by residential, and that one is from 2015. And this is King Street and Sherbourne. The picture on the left is 1979. The one on the right is from 2018. And you'll see that the building on the left is being incorporated into the building, the condominium in the later picture. And that building was a branch of the Imperial Bank of Canada that was put up in 1908. What we're seeing is, in the case of many historical buildings, the facade is being preserved. Some people refer to this as facadism, and this is a very good example of that phenomenon.
So it's interesting. We've seen these photos of so much change and, scenes that are completely unrecognizable. But when you get out of the downtown core and when you get out of the old industrial areas that have become new neighborhoods and get into those old neighborhoods that were built by the streetcar over 100 years ago, you actually see the durability of the built environment. You see that a lot of the buildings are still there, a lot of the houses are still there, and actually you can take these photos from the 1960s and you can orient yourself and explore these parts of the city because the landscapes are so similar. There are a few exceptions to this. We talked about Regent Park, that first public housing project built in the 1940s, which replaced a Victorian era neighborhood that was declared a slum by the city. Well, by the early 2000s, by the mid 2010s, when the photo on the right was taken, that neighborhood too had been demolished and replaced with a mixed use, mixed income neighborhood, sort of bringing in some of the old urban fabric, and bit by bit, Regent Park has been destroyed or been demolished and replaced. But
And
again,
one interesting thing, Brian, Regent Park was what they call a food desert. And when they did the redevelopment, there's now a grocery store on that corner.
yep, yeah, there were no businesses in a whole big super block, right? It was all public housing. Now it's a real mix, and we're only about, well, we're less than a mile from the heart of downtown here, so very accessible by streetcar as well.
And there's
But
a Tim Hortons there too.
there is, absolutely, of course. But again, it's the exception that proves the rule. And same here with this Honest Ed's, which was a kind of unique department store, one sort of in Toronto that kept growing over many decades, and that the site was sold to a developer and knocked down and redeveloped. But much of the streetcar city doesn't look like this. It looks more like this. We're out in the east end of Toronto on Upper Gerrard, a really nice streetcar ride if you're ever in the city, one of the nicest rides to go on, but you can see that a lot of the houses are still the same, and this would be the same kind of thing throughout a lot of the network. Now, it doesn't mean the neighborhoods haven't changed. These neighborhoods have by and large become wealthier. It costs a lot more money to buy those houses comparatively than it did in the 1960s. They've also lost a lot of population. A lot of neighborhoods in the city, as these photos illustrate, have not seen new housing come in. So as demographics change, as household composition changes, some streetcar neighborhoods relatively close to downtown have seen as much of their populations decline by as much as a quarter since the 1970s, which obviously has ramifications for transit use, for amenities, for schools, and all sorts of things. And it's a really interesting photo, I think, to end with, because we think of Toronto becoming this big international city, this city of finance, Canada's largest city, the skyscrapers, the towers, and all that's happening around the streetcar network. But when you get out and actually explore the network and ride the system, photograph the lines, as many of you do in your own communities, and hopefully have a chance to come up to Toronto and do as well, you see a lot more variation, a lot more, um, a lot of different interpretations of what that looks like in different parts of the city. Now, we promised you a plug for our book. The book is still available. It came out in 2022. Some of the photos that we took as the second views are now themselves a little bit dated if you know the city. So that also makes the book an interesting addition to one's collection, because nothing stays the same in cities. If you're interested in the book, the QR code there takes you right to the University of Toronto Press website where you can buy it, but you can buy it anywhere it's available in all sorts of places. And I hope you've all enjoyed this tour, this talk. I think we're a little bit longer than we had anticipated, but there's certainly a lot to talk about in Toronto. So I think we will just end it there, and we can stick around if there are any questions. But just like to thank you all for sticking with us, and I hope you enjoyed our history and visual tour of Toronto.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So